Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please like it, leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, whether it's on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you get this podcast, like it, leave a review. That allows other people to also find it. Thank you so much. In this episode, I'm really excited to present a guest, Professor Daniel Rynhold. Now, Professor Rynhold was on a previous season of the podcast, and he was also a teacher of mine when I was studying philosophy at University College London. I took a course on medieval Jewish philosophy given by him at King's College. That was before he moved to the United States, and now he is the dean of the graduate program in Jewish studies at YU, the Revel program. He is a true scholar, and as you will see throughout the podcast, also a very humble man. He is a person who really understands philosophy in general and has a very deep grasp of Judaism and Jewish philosophy all the way throughout the ages. And you will see that throughout the podcast. So I discussed with Daniel Rynhold the idea of Judaism and postmodernism and what his view of it was. And he has a very nuanced approach, which I think a lot of you out there will find really interesting. There are some elements of postmodernism which he seems to accept, and others which he says Judaism does not accept at all. I tried to push back a little bit on his point of view of the part of Judaism which he thought was compatible with postmodernism, and I'll let you, the audience, decide whether I was successful in making my counter argument to him. But I would never consider Professor Rynhold to be a postmodernist. We also discussed Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's approach to postmodernism and Judaism, and he says that his view and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory's view are very similar. So those who are interested in postmodernism and Judaism, this is a voice that it's really important to listen to and to understand the nuanced approach to it. So with no further ado, I introduce to you my former teacher, and for the second time on this podcast, Professor Daniel Rynhold. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation again for this podcast. Really, really grateful.
Pleasure.
I've done this series on postmodernism, and as a philosopher yourself, I just thought it would be just so wonderful to have you on, talk about postmodernism, and also as, you know, so steeped in Jewish philosophy and Judaism, to get your thoughts on this. To begin, can you give us how you define postmodernism, just high level?
Postmodernism, there's no sort of unified, I don't think, theory or definition. It's sort of a cluster of different ideas and even disciplines, as you know, postmodernism in terms of how philosophers define it, postmodernism in art, in architecture, in all kinds of different realms. But I guess, speaking as a philosopher, I think there are two central themes that I would identify as the key kind of postmodern challenge or outlook. One of them is metaphysical, I suppose, and one of them epistemological. So let's start with the metaphysical. So sort of a classic idea that sort of reigned all the way through to maybe Kant. I mean, that's not entirely fair. There are those who would question it beforehand, but you know, the basic idea would be that there is a truth out there. There is a way the world is, and as philosophers or as scientists, doesn't really matter, as knowers, what we're trying to do is to reflect that truth out there in here, right? So our ideas ought to correspond to the way the world is, right? So the world is structured a certain way, and to know the world is to have ideas that correspond to that structure, kind of correspondence theory of truth. And that's the sort of basic metaphysical form of realism, you could call it. There's the real world out there. It's mind independent. Doesn't matter what I think about it. The world is a certain way, and I can either get it right or get it wrong. So that's number one. That metaphysical thesis is questioned by postmodernism, right? Postmoderns argue, no, there is no way the world is. This idea that there is some structured way the world is simply is not the case. We are, so to speak, creators of world through our linguistic and conceptual systems. So we construct a world rather than reflect it. So it's sort of almost the original view, or the view that's been questioned, is a sort of photographic view of reality. There's reality, and we're meant to take a photo.
Is it that there is no reality, or that the human cannot objectively know what that reality is?
So that's the thing. I would argue there are two different components. One is there is no reality, as in there is no way the world is, that is purely just presented to us unvarnished, that we can photograph and reflect. The second view is the epistemological, and that comes to the epistemological view, which is independent, I guess, because you might think there's a way the world is, but we can't possibly know it. Now, postmodernism on the whole would go with both of those. There is no way the world is, and therefore, obviously, we can't know it. But you could, logically, the two are distinct. You could argue there's a way the world is, independent of our minds, but we are so constituted that we cannot climb out of our own conceptual systems so as to just know it in some purely objective sense. I would argue there are those two components to it. One is about the nature of reality. One is about what we can and can't know. And postmodernism, as I understand it, I don't claim to be a great expert in postmodernism, but as I understand it, the key challenges that the postmodern worldview kind of throws at us are both of those. There is no way the world is, and therefore, relatedly, obviously, there is no way to know the world as it is, because there is no such thing as the world as it is.
Which seems really interesting, because if you say that there is no way in which you can know what the world is because we can't objectively know that, then you can't know that there is no way that the world
Right.
actually is either.
Absolutely. And this is one of the paradoxes of postmodern, which many of them would welcome. Say, yeah, absolutely. Right. It's all, everything, it's all up for grabs, such that everything collapses in on itself. The most extreme versions of postmodernism, I don't think would necessarily balk at that conclusion. Right. But the other by the way, the other epistemological component that's very important is just to do with the structure of human rationality, right? And going back to the Enlightenment, and the view again would be that there is this thing called reason. It is universal. All rational human beings, share those methods of thought so as to arrive through rational methods at the truth. And therefore, if we are all thinking correctly and working correctly, we will all end up with the same conclusion. Now, that idea that there is this single thing called universal reason, that's if we are all thinking aright, we will therefore agree on everything, is also exploded by postmodernism, that says there is no such thing. Reason is always culturally situated.
Yeah.
There are no meta narratives, that kind of is a term they like to use, and therefore there simply is no single version canon of rational principles that all human beings, if they are thinking aright, will utilize and arrive at the same conclusions, right? And that kind of also feeds into the idea, therefore, that across these different narratives, it might be that it's not possible for me to prove superiority of mine over somebody else's, because we're just not starting out from the same basic premises, and maybe not even using the very same canons of reasoning. Those are I guess, the key elements that I would identify as the postmodern philosophical challenge.
And just to put a fine point of the words you used, which is that you said that postmodernism has exploded this. In their mind, they've exploded it. That doesn't mean they've successfully.
Oh, no,
You're not
absolutely.
saying, okay.
Yes. Though I am sympathetic to some of these points.
Okay. So would you agree that this was a counter-enlightenment movement.
Yeah. I mean, effectively that idea of universal reason,
Yeah.
unprejudiced by any sort of tradition, or as they might have it, superstition or bias, right? We get rid of all of that. We are a pure subject and we strip away all of our own biases and prejudices to see the world as it is, and thus agree that things are thus and so. That's very much the Enlightenment dream, right?
Yeah.
Universal reason, we're all the same, everybody's equal, has political ramifications as well that are in many ways positive, but strip all that away such that we can all come to the same ultimate truth is I think very much the Enlightenment ideal, and begins to break down with Kant.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is really wonderful encapsulation of what postmodernism is. And now turning to Judaism for a moment. Some people have argued that Judaism actually has elements of postmodernism in it. And some people have even argued, when I was back many, many years ago, while I was actually doing my master's degree and I was studying with you medieval Jewish philosophy, I also was taking a class from Dr. Tali Lowenthal at UCL, and he was doing Hasidism and modernity. And his argument at that time was that Hasidism, and specifically the Chabad school of Hasidism, was uniquely postmodern. And I think that he and others in that school have really kind of doubled down on that, rightly or wrongly. But that's one example of people arguing that Judaism is postmodern. But there are many others, Rav Shagar and others who've basically jumped on this bandwagon and said Judaism is actually postmodern. What do you think? And when you look out at the canon that is Jewish literature?
I think that there are elements within Judaism that are sympathetic to some of the things that I just outlined. And I say that it's difficult to say about Judaism writ large, but there are thinkers who are pretty mainstream, if you like, traditional thinkers who, I do think absorb elements of this sort of postmodern mindset, but not to the extreme of therefore entirely deconstructing the notion that there is any truth at all out there. So I think that the metaphysical question maybe is something I think it would be difficult to impose that on Judaism. But I think that at the epistemological level, there are elements where Judaism can recognize the limits of reason, you might say, that sort of emerge out of the postmodern critique. And I'd also add that I would carve out a special place, if you like, for Jewish faith qua practice. And the more, again, I hesitate to use the term postmodern, but certainly a recognition of some of the points that I made earlier within the self-understanding of Jewish practice.
So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the elements of Judaism, which you would say are not postmodern,
it is much more difficult at the metaphysical level,
yeah,
to pin postmodernism on Judaism. Now, I should add, as somebody who comes out of a more philosophical mindset, it might well be, in fact, I think it could be said that in mysticism, there are elements of Jewish mysticism that are more open to these more paradoxical, contradictory type of statements. And I'm not well versed enough to be able to expound on those. But when it comes to the philosophical realm, I would say that it's very difficult to maintain that Judaism doesn't hold certain truths about the nature of reality. But when I say reality there, I guess I'm talking about the ultimate reality, which is God, because there's no question that Judaism would assert certain things, at least, and again, it kind of, I suppose, depends where you're coming from. If you're a dyed-in-the-wool Maimonidean negative theologian, can't say anything positive about God, right? Well, then, yeah, it's kind of difficult to posit certain truths about the nature of God.
Yeah.
However, that still, to me, would not bespeak anything postmodern, because there are things that it seems Judaism would categorically deny about God, such as God has been incarnated in history through a human being, right? As in, claims about Jesus in Christianity.
Yeah.
It seems pretty clear to me that Judaism absolutely rejects that. So even if we don't think we can specify positively the nature of God, there are certain things that we do seem to claim as clearly false, right? And
Yes.
therefore, the idea that anything goes, that there is no structure to reality, and here I'm just talking about the reality of God in as much as one can speak of it, it seems to me that you can't go down a postmodern route there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, in other words, postmodernism would say, well, if you come from this culture which believes that, then that's your truth, and that's good enough, and it's equal to the truth of somebody else who thinks that God can incarnate in the flesh, for example,
Right.
right?
But again, that's where I draw a distinction,
Yeah,
because again, the claim I'm making right now is the metaphysical one.
yeah,
So I think Judaism would rule out, at the very
yeah,
least,
yeah,
certain claims about the nature of God, right?
yes,
What God is like metaphysically. And again, if you're not Maimonidean, you'd go much further and say there are certain positive things we can say about God,
yeah,
which allow us to rule out other things about God. So there's,
yeah,
clearly claims we make about the reality of God. But that's at the metaphysical level. At the epistemological level,
hmm,
there I'm less convinced that we can make the claim, which I think is a claim you just made, regarding other people's truth. And what I mean by that is the following. I don't believe that there is a neutral ground upon which, some Archimedean point, so to speak, from which I could argue that a Christian who believes in the divinity of Jesus
hmm,
is irrational. As in, I don't think I can prove that to them
right,
on neutral grounds. And that's where the kind of epistemological limits on reason that grow out of postmodernism, I think there's something to that. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't believe they're wrong. It also, and that I believe Judaism is correct, and that I can give arguments for that.
hmm,
It's just, I don't think that those arguments will necessarily convince somebody who is coming from
yeah.
very different
But
foundations. So that's
but
that's
do
a broad
you
distinction.
but do you have to accept as a Jew that your arguments are stronger than their arguments?
So yes, I think that, well, I don't know whether you have to. I
No, in
think,
other words, what I mean is, so it seems to me when God descends upon Mount Sinai in the Bible, he
mhm,
says, the first thing he's out of his mouth is, he doesn't say, I'm the Lord your God who created heaven and earth,
yeah,
as
yeah,
the Rishonim kind of point out. Why
yeah,
not?
yeah,
Seems to me he's trying to bring some kind of evidence for his, like, what the hell am I doing here? You know me. I've shown you who I am. And now I'm trying to bring some evidence for why you should listen to the next thing I've got to say. I
yeah,
guess the point I'm trying to make is that it seems to me that Judaism kind of fundamentally believes in this idea that, look at the evidence, and then the evidence will show you.
agreed.
And when
Yes.
you reason together with the evidence, it will take you to where. But this is kind of, it seems like this, if you just look throughout everything, this is kind of part of what it tries to present itself as somewhat of a rational religion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think,
So it relies on this idea of reason
yes.
to take
Yeah,
you
no, it
through.
absolutely, it does. That's an argument, and that's an argument that Yehuda Levi gives
No,
in his Arik very, very explicitly,
but
right?
no, I'm actually arguing that God argued
Yeah, that's
that he has
what,
evidence. I'm
right.
bringing,
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's the way kind of Yehuda Levi presents it there, right?
okay,
But the problem is that, and it's important to say, I agree with you in terms of, I do, if I'm asked to look critically
yeah,
at Judaism, vis-a-vis other religions, I do find it more convincing, right? I do. I think the argument, all of that, yeah. However, I am aware that the reason that I think that is in some way culturally conditioned, because I imagine had I been brought up next door in the Hindu house next door, I'd probably be convinced about Hinduism, right? So I do think there is a contingency to it, and that there are cultural um, contexts that allow us to evaluate arguments
But
differently.
if you go that way,
Yeah.
then you end up saying that there aren't some right ideas and some wrong ideas. You know,
No, so that's where I disagree. I think you end up saying there are right ideas and wrong ideas, but you're also aware that the only way you can demonstrate those is culturally conditioned. But that doesn't mean you don't think they're right and the other is wrong,
no,
or
but then
rational and the other is not.
correct. But what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, you're only saying that you think yours is right because you're brought up to think this is right.
Well, no, I think
Correct.
it is more than that, because when I critically reflect, I still
Mhm.
think that if it was just it's the way I was brought up,
Mhm.
finished, then yeah, okay, there are plenty of people who don't think about these things, and that works. But when you do evaluate it critically, right, I
Mhm.
still think that. Right now, I also still understand that my thinking that is in some way culturally conditioned, but because if you cease to believe
Mhm.
there is a single thing called universal reason, right, that
Mhm.
everybody has and everybody will agree. So let if well let me maybe approach it the other way. If you think that,
Mhm.
then you would have to take every religion, right? You'd have this standard called truth, and you'd, measure them, and you'd make
Yeah.
sure Judaism has the most of it. And if it doesn't, you're in big trouble, right? But as soon
Yeah.
as you collapse
Yeah.
that,
And
as soon as you don't think there's one measure,
yeah.
then you understand the only measure is always going to be in some way,
Yeah.
right? In some way, culturally biased, right? And not in a pernicious way,
But
right?
why
It's
would you
just the
want to
nature of
collapse
human
that though?
being. Why would I want to collapse that? Because I find it unconvincing. I think it's very difficult to argue that a convinced member of another religion is somehow irrational.
Well, they might not be entirely irrational, but they haven't yet reached the depth of understanding or the bar, the highest bar. They could, with more knowledge, more understanding, more study, having been exposed to better ideas, get to, a higher, deeper understanding of things.
Right. So that I don't find that convincing.
But
I
why
don't
not?
think that there's a higher level of not, because I just don't think that kind of every Jew is a genius, and far more
But
able
that's not
to
the argument.
acquire truth than anybody else. And by the way, which is not to say, right, for me, this is a very Kantian type thing in terms
Yeah.
of arguing limits of knowledge, kind of in order to make room for faith.
Mhm.
I have ultimately, I think this is the place for faith, right? Where we have faith that this is the case. In my case, it's a faith that I do believe I can back up with all kinds of arguments,
Yeah.
right? But I am aware that those arguments are not going to be convincing, or are unlikely to convince somebody who is completely immersed in a different conceptual scheme.
Yeah, but that's probably true. It will not convince them. But that's not because there isn't some kind of objective.
I agree.
One would argue.
It's not because there isn't an objective truth. I just don't, and this is where the metaphysical and
Yeah.
epistemological come apart. Even if I do, and I do believe,
Yeah.
right, that Jesus was not God, right?
Yes.
I just don't believe there is any way as a human being
Hmm.
to convince somebody on completely neutral premises that
Hmm.
that's the case. But
Yeah.
I absolutely do. I believe it. Absolutely. Could I argue for it? 100%. It's just I don't believe that argument is something that will be recognized as a pure rational argument that any right-thinking human being will follow.
Right. That might be the case, but the question is then, you might say he's rational, I'm rational, we're both rational, we both can come to conclusions about something which might differ. Rational minds and reasonable minds can come to different conclusions on things.
Yeah.
But ultimately, is there one which is closer to the objective reality that we've spoken about? Because if, right, the metaphysical, you say, okay, I don't accept the metaphysical argument of postmodernism. So if that's the case, then is there an ability for rationality to get closer to that, let's call it the metaphysical standard
Yeah.
of absolute fact, let's call it? Or it's just that rationality can never get us there, and therefore we just have to have a emunah pshuta, the simple blind faith that somehow, although my rational arguments are equal to everyone else's rational arguments, mine are somehow better.
Yeah. So like I said, I don't think it's simple blind faith.
But if you're going to say that, your Hindu neighbor next door is just as rational to worship their cows
Yes.
as you are to worship Israel, the God
Yeah.
of Israel,
Yeah.
then you and they both have good rational arguments for them. Then the reason why you're accepting yours as the better one is because I was brought up that way, and therefore I somehow believe that is the correct. But it's not. There's no way I can show that this is more closer to that metaphysical fact or standard than
Yeah,
theirs
but
is.
but you see what you keep devolving to is can't show that. And yeah, I don't think I can show that, but I absolutely believe it and think I can show it in terms that are convincing given what the way that I reason, right? And
Yeah.
that's what you can go by. And see, and the thing I was saying before is as soon as you get rid of that single
Yeah.
thing, and if you believe no, there isn't such a thing, the best human rationality can be
Mm-hmm.
is always internal to a certain context, right? Well, then, and I'll qualify that in a moment, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But then at that point, the fact that your arguments are convincing within that context is the best you can do and renders it totally irrational to jump ship and do something else that you believe by the only canons of rationality available to human beings, internal,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I believe that to be irrational,
Mm-hmm.
then the least rational thing to do as a human being is to do that, right?
Yeah, but if you immerse yourself in your neighbor's house,
But why would I do that? Because that's an irrational thing for me to do,
no,
given my rationality.
well, there are people who want to experience other people's cultures to the depth,
Yeah, no, sure, there are,
and that's not irrational. And
no, by their canons, maybe not. I mean, I'm not. Again, I would argue as to why it is, given this sort of meta philosophy, right? But again, might not convince them, and that's something I have to accept. And
there are
by the
plenty.
way,
Yeah.
what I would add here is I do think there is some recognition within Judaism of
Mhm.
these limits because as we know, and despite the odd maybe certain minor historical aberrations, we're not a missionary religion that
Yes.
goes out there and argues that everybody ought to be doing the things we do. And also, we recognize the sort of, I don't want to call it irrational, but we recognize that one comes to a religion in the way of family and custom, right? You're born
Yeah.
Jewish. It's not something that you decide, and obviously there are converts, so it's not only that, but the fact you're born into it, right? So you're just born with certain obligations that you don't rationally evaluate and decide, oh, should I take them on or should I not? Should I be confirmed? All of that, right? Does seem to jive with this kind of element of contingency regards religious identity and religious belief. So I think there's an opening. I'm not this in no way is a proof or anything like it, but it's
Yeah.
definitely an opening to saying, Judaism kind of gets the limits of human rationality on this stuff and allows, Hasideo Moto Alam and all that. We're good with that.
Yeah. I think because it seems to me we're good with it because we don't need everyone. There's variations. there's like midvah sheketirchak, and then there's, there's this idea also of like, of tzedek. It never says get to the ultimate truth. So wherever people are on that spectrum, as long as they're moving away from falsehoods close to truth, that's fine. That's why in the land of Israel, you could have people, as long as they're idol worshippers, they don't have to accept everything.
Yeah.
That's what it seems to me. So we're not really expecting other people to reach that standard. But I find the argument which you're trying to make, which says that on the one hand, there is a standard from a metaphysical perspective. On the other hand, it's like a tentative acceptance of that standard. It doesn't really take full conviction towards it. Because the second you say someone else's could be equal to mine, in a sense, it's tentative to the conviction to your own standard.
Right. So I don't think that's the case. And what you've mentioned is conviction. And conviction is ultimately a subjective matter, right? And whether you're convinced of something
Correct.
is subjective. I'm completely convinced. That conviction isn't knocked in any way by the recognition that there is no way for me to universally demonstrate its truth.
So you're saying there's no way for me to universally demonstrate it, or you're saying, because you're saying that's something different than saying there's no way for me to universally demonstrate it in a way that someone else can accept it. Those are two separate things, I think.
Yeah, they are, but there's an implication. If I'm universally demonstrating, if I demonstrate something to some kind of universal standard of rationality, then the fact that I don't think I will be able to convince anybody who isn't Jewish does imply that they are somehow sub-rational, and that's not.
Well,
I'm willing to.
There's so many arguments that I've had with people where I've tried to, very intelligent people, I've tried to convince them of things which seem to me to be patently, false.
I've had those arguments too. Absolutely.
And these people, they just accept it and believe it, and we know, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories out there which people swear by and believe, very intelligent people. And what it turns out to me is that the more intelligent they are, the better they are at arguing for these total cockamamie arguments, which are or facts which are completely wrong. So
yeah, but there, I would hesitate there because, one of the problems, of course, is that once you go down this route, everybody will always say, well, that's just another bias, right?
Yes.
But I would say there are certain things where there just is evidence and there are facts and people are denying the facts, right?
Yes.
And that's not okay. You can't deny the facts, right? So I don't know. I don't know what your I know not of your listenership, right?
Yeah.
But right now there are a lot of people who believe that Donald Trump won the last election.
Correct.
Now, all the facts clearly demonstrate it's not the case, including by, Republican governors who recount, right? So there's just the inability to accept facts at that point. Even though I can't prove anything to those people, I have no interest in speaking to them.
Yes.
Genuinely, right? So there are people who are beyond the pale, and they're beyond the pale because they deny facts. Now, in argument, in the kind of religious arguments that maybe we're talking about, I don't think the arguments are of that nature, such that I can just discount them and say, well, you're an idiot, right? And this is important because in terms of the postmodern elements, shall we say, right? At least to the extent of the limits of rationality, of human rationality, or the limits of our ability to demonstrate things on completely neutral grounds. So when I was talking about reality, and I specifically said God and certain claims about God, I think that there is some truth to the postmodern idea that there is no single way the world is, but not in a way that dissolves all truth. Because I think there are multiple ways the world is. There is more than one true way to describe the world, but each one has standards such that you can get things right and wrong. So again, it doesn't devolve into everything falls apart. It's just, no, here's one way of looking at it, here's another. They're both valid, they're both legitimate, they come from different perspectives, but they both have standards of truth and they aren't necessarily incompatible, right? Sometimes they might be. But yeah, so that even on the metaphysical question, right? Other than the one absolute God that we can't know much about precisely because we can't know absolutes given our that we approach things through a conceptual scheme. When it comes
Yes.
to looking at the world, I do think
Yeah.
there's more than one true way to describe it, and no one has should be sovereign over any other. I mean, just for example, we can look at each other as physicists, right? And I can just analyze everything in terms of atoms and molecules bumping into each other. I mean, that's a very obviously that's a pathetic way of describing it because you dig down far much further. But
Yeah.
that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Or I can describe it in terms of no, you're a person with emotions, right? Those are
Yeah.
two different discourses entirely,
They can both be correct.
and they can both be true, right? Now, whether they're entirely compatible with each other is actually a question in terms of free will, but again, that's okay. I'm happy to allow that one of those discourses is deterministic and the other is not. But yeah, so to that extent, even there, you can start to talk about multiple ways of describing the world.
Yeah. Yes, but it does seem to me, though, that there are along the spectrum, if we can talk about the spectrum, things which are more correct and less correct. In other words, what bothers me a little bit is like
Yeah.
this saying that they're equal, right? And that I don't have the ability to say that one's better than the other in any kind of objective way.
Mhm.
It seems to me that that's something that Judaism doesn't accept. It seems like to me Judaism is saying, look at the evidence,
Mhm.
and through the evidence and through the brain that you've been given and the evidence you've been given, and if you do it well enough, you will come closer to reality. Let's not call it truth, close to truth. You might
Sure.
not get there all the way, you know, as Maimonides says at the beginning of the guide, that actually that was taken away from humans. So that's fine to say absolute truth was taken away from humans. We're never going to get to the absolute truth, but you can get closer to it and further away from it. Some idea is just going to be closer to the falsehoods, and some are going to be closer to the truth.
Yep.
And that if you actually, really analyze the evidence enough and think about it, and we might say, yes, Jews have done that more than others. We're a nation of scholars. You might want to make that argument. And the fact is that most of the world have taken on a lot of our ideas.
Yeah,
You know,
no, sure. Yeah, yeah. But again, I wouldn't deny that I believe that on certain things we are closer to the truth.
yeah.
And for me, yes, that is based up to a point on evidence and argument, 100%. It's just, again, it comes back to the point of whether or not that evidence and those
But
arguments are going to be convincing to all rational humans insofar as they
but
are
that's
rational.
fine if they're not going
That's
to,
I don't
because
that I
you
don't
can't.
accept.
But you can't convince a Trump supporter that that you.
Correct, but it's different. That's
And this,
because
I
yeah,
know some very, very, very
agreed.
smart people,
Yes.
right? And this is where it comes down to it, but on the left and right seem to be postmodernists here, because the right play
Yeah.
hard and fast with the facts when
Yeah.
it suits them. They're postmodernists when it suits them, and the left are postmodernists when it suits them. I think Judaism comes down on the side which says no.
100%. Look,
Yeah,
I absolutely agree with you that for Judaism there are things that are well, here again we get into two different things. So on the one hand, we can talk
yes,
about things that are true and false, right? Jesus is
hmm
the Son of God, false, according to
hmm
Judaism, right? And for me, according to Judaism, it's false means it is false, right? It's just false, simplicity, right? Fine. I'm perfectly happy to accept that. I am happy I can give arguments for that. I get all of that, but I also accept that those arguments won't convince everyone, right? So, but
okay,
that would totally accept. That would be number one. Number
yeah,
two, and this is where the political thing becomes interesting. In the realm of practice, I think there is more room for maneuver, right?
but let me just double click on this. That I can't convince anyone. Why should that matter? That's what I'm trying to figure
I,
out.
I don't know. Well, it might matter practically, right? Into and that's where you get in the on the question of the nature of God, for example, I'm not sure it does, right? The fact I can't convince somebody um of certain claims about God, I'm not sure it does matter as long as they're decent, upstanding, moral human beings.
Hmm.
not sure it does matter, frankly.
I mean, is it okay to say, well, they can be wrong and still be good people?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And
No,
more
but
than that, they say that about me, and I'm good with that.
no, but they might be wrong to say that about you, just like the person can be wrong to say that Biden lost the election and in other
No,
words,
but so here's the distinction. The distinction is whether we're arguing about facts that are kind of publicly verifiable facts, right? Which on the election it is, and the nature of God, which frankly isn't, right? So that one can accept that somebody who disagrees with me about the nature of God, right, up to a point, is not denying any obvious facts. And therefore, they're rational people, and we can agree to disagree. Right? When it comes to the denial of facts on a topic that is an empirically based kind of argument, well, then they're just not really playing the game anymore. And therefore, I don't see why one ought to, or how one can engage sensibly with. And that's just, by the way, this isn't itself a political point. This is just about denial of facts, right? You can support whoever you want policy wise. I'm just talking about people who would deny, facts about who won an election, for example, right? But yeah, when it comes to practice, I think there is more leeway, because I do think there can be genuinely more than one way to live a good life. And one can have very real disagreements on some really important issues, and yet still see that, writ large, the other way of life is a good life. And that's very much, again, in Judaism, I think the whole Elu Ve'elu thing sort of helps us come to terms with that, right? For a Jew, there are many ways we could live, but there are, for obvious reasons, right, there has to be a decision, and that's the decision. And legally, therefore, one is bound and one lives a certain way, but one can accept that there is another way that is equally valid, even though it's not the one that's passed into law. But therefore, if some other section of society lived in accordance with such things, that would be okay.
Let me summarize what I think I'm hearing from you, and just to, in my own mind, see if I'm getting this right. There's a number of categories here, right? So there's a category which you're saying is a matter of like just rational argument rather than facts. I can make very good rational arguments for the Jewish metaphysical claims, which feel very convincing to me. But since they're not facts-based, you recognize that there are other people who can make other metaphysical arguments which are convincing to them. Yours seems more convincing to you. Theirs seems more convincing to them, but that might be conditioned by your upbringing. Then there's facts, which we can actually verify. And that we, together with our intellect, if we're looking at the same facts, we ought never to come, if we're rational, to differing conclusions.
Again, be careful on the never, because you can base certain arguments on facts where you agree on the facts, but you have a different interpretation.
Right.
But there are certain things where it's not a matter of different interpretation. You're just denying the fact altogether.
Okay. Right? So if we all can agree, we could bring in the facts, we could bring, whatever it's the witnesses, we could bring the video recording, whatever it is you have to show what happened. And now if you're just denying that, then we're not in. And then you've got practice.
Yes.
Is what you're saying. And practice is this area where you can actually have very, very different views. One person with ways of practice which are just as good as each other.
Yeah, well, and again, I wouldn't necessarily say they're just as good as each other on particular details. There are things where I believe a certain thing and somebody else believes something else. But I understand that a person is coming to that conclusion based on a different hierarchy of values. That even though I disagree with it, I can't argue it's somehow illegitimate, and there is no way for me to prove. And this is very much politics, right? Liberty and equality. Which one do you prioritize more, and you can have, and I do have, right, plenty of friends who prioritize those differently and
Yeah.
therefore come to different views on some of those things, and it's not because they're either irrational or evil, right? It's just on certain things they think, no, this is more important, and I don't see any neutral way of deciding that. And therefore you can have, two ways of life that are good ways of life that can differ on some quite significant issues.
But
And yeah.
we might all agree, for example, I'm going to just throw this out, and then I know this is highly controversial, but the child sacrifice, right? No one's doing it today, hopefully, but
Yeah.
Abraham attempted it.
Yep.
But we all would agree today that is something which is not a good way to live one's life.
Agreed.
But maybe some people would argue it is a good way.
Yeah, and I don't know how you'd prove that they were wrong. I completely 100% with total conviction, to come back to your point, with no doubt in my mind whatsoever, right, believe they're wrong and everything should be done to prevent them doing it, including, using all the powers that the law invests in us to prevent such things, right? Is there some, neutral way on the basis of pure rationality and logic to prove that? I don't know.
So it's really interesting because it seems to me that there are better ideas and worse ideas.
I agree.
So that's why I struggle with these categories. I think I
Yeah.
understand the categories it's true that there are facts which you can't deny. And I think that's demonstrable.
Yeah.
But then when you start there's facts at the top, but then you go lower down, just very good, solid, very strong ideas, right?
Yeah.
And now when we say that all those could be relative to each other, and then rationality is this thing that doesn't have an absolute, we can end up in that situation we just mentioned, that I can't show you how child sacrifice, I can't show you how Hamas is actually worse than the Israeli army.
I can't show somebody who, and we know, tragically, what you said is clearly true, as we see.
Yes.
Right?
But that doesn't mean that they're right. In other words,
100, absolutely. Again, I completely agree. It doesn't mean they're absolutely wrong.
But there are ideas which are better ideas, right? And sometimes when you look at,
and you hope that those over time, when it comes, again, this is where you have to distinguish between, different discourses, right? So I don't know, medicine, right? There are things that work and don't work, and that's an end of it, right? And unless you don't care about staying alive or getting better, you'll, the right answer, right, is to take that pill or that medication, or right? No question.
Yeah.
Right? Fine. When it comes to, as I say, ethics or politics, I think that, well, no, maybe it's naive to say that ultimately the good ideas win out. I think in the trajectory of history, we're doing better.
I think,
right?
But is postmodernism taking us a few
you're right.
steps
You do
back?
begin to worry whether you are or not.
But that's my main concern here, right? Is postmodernism really giving us permission to take some steps back and delve back into really bad ideas? This is kind of what I'm.
Why is it giving us permission to do that?
Because when everything becomes relative, and you can say something like, I can't show you why child sacrifice, right, is actually not bad. I know it is, you believe in it, but I can't show it to you. And because I can't show the doofus living God knows where, that doesn't mean that child sacrifice is not a uniquely bad idea.
I absolutely agree.
Right. So, but just because I can't show it, and I think we've been bashed over the head in some sense with this idea, I have to respect you because and I can't call you an idiot because
so
never going to accept it, and therefore, well, maybe we should call them an idiot.
But I don't think one does have to accept the validity of something abhorrent, right? Just
doesn't have to accept it, but the second you say,
doesn't mean that you need to respect it.
But I don't respect it, but the second I can't say that their bad ideas, it has less rationality than my good ideas.
No, but I think they do,
because I can't convince them.
But you can say that, you can't convince them. That's you can try, maybe you can, but
not convincing people. Why is that a standard? I'm just trying to get it. Why is that a standard? Not being able to convince somebody.
what so I'm not sure what you mean by the
In
question.
other words, just
You
because I
seem
can't
to
come.
be holding that up as you seem to be the one who's desperately wants that to be the stat, right? You want us to be able to do that.
No, I don't. I don't.
Oh, okay. All right.
I don't. But can I not say there
Hmm.
are some people just not going to get it?
Yep.
I don't won't be able to convince them. But
Yep.
their idea is uniquely valid, and I can
Yep.
show it in all kinds of ways. The fact
You
that they're
can
not
say
going to
all
get
of
it,
that. You can say all of that, yes. And the fact that they don't
then,
get it is their problem. I agree.
but wouldn't Judaism make that same argument?
Yes,
That's what I'm saying.
100%. Yeah, oh yeah. No question it would. Yeah.
Which is not a modern. It's not a postmodern argument then.
No, it's not in the sense of it's not relativistic. It doesn't hold
Yeah.
that everything goes, doesn't hold that everything's equally valuable. And I haven't at any point said that. All I've said is there are limits to our ability to prove that to people,
Hmm.
right, who don't accept the same basic starting points as we do. And there's a continuum here,
Yeah.
right? Because there are people who are thoroughly decent, wonderful people who don't accept the same starting points as I do,
Yeah.
but we can all live together peaceably in society
Yeah.
because we all share enough of the basics, right? So it doesn't matter. And then there are people who
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
way beyond that and are therefore not part, can't form part of that discourse. So, in terms of what you can and can't prove, there are the more kind of egregious disagreements
Hmm.
that you just can't live with peaceably in society, and there are those that you can. And but there's no difference in terms of the again, according to this type of, let's call it postmodern contribution, there's no difference in the ability to demonstrate the truth of your view in a
Hmm.
way that begins from premises with which they agree and such that
Hmm.
you'd be able to argue them into it. But
Right.
ultimately, it's more of a practical matter, which of those are therefore deeply problematic, such
Hmm.
that we cannot admit these people into our community, and those who we can,
Yeah.
and community writ large in terms
Yeah.
of, yeah.
It's interesting just to because it reminds me you said the Trump thing, but also the vaccine thing, for example, which I found mind-boggling because those who haven't studied statistics, for example, and don't understand how double-blind studies work, etc., um, they can say anything, and they have said anything,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
they all have their own doctors on side, right? That doesn't mean that the anti-vax side is a correct
Yeah.
side,
Yeah. I
but
mean, that gets into
we're
more
asked to kind of
theological
respect them,
issue,
though.
which is that nowadays every idiot can have a million followers on,
Yeah.
what it is. And I say that in full knowledge that we are on this right now, and someone will think we're idiots doing the same, but whatever. Um, you know, uh, we have some qualifications in something that such
Yeah.
that some of what we're saying maybe has some basis.
At least we claim to, and some people seem to admit it, or other things
Yeah.
think that actually makes us uniquely disqualified. But
Yeah.
I think what concerns me about it, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this series on postmodernism, and I really appreciate you bring some clarity to this, is because it seems to me that when you say everything goes, I think left and right are both guilty of doing this, even though one says they're not postmodern. It seems like the zeitgeist is so deeply embedded that it's hard to get away from it. Well,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how thought out in terms of, postmodern philosophy these are. The extreme, but you're right, the extremes at both ends are equally culpable for whether it's denying, well, I mean, there are instances in both cases where they deny facts, and
yeah,
it's deeply troubling, and or have hold certain moral values that are deeply troubling. Sure, whether, I mean, it does, nothing happens in isolation or in a vacuum, so the fact that we live in a world where a version of postmodernism that I think is maybe an extreme that I
Hmm.
don't know how many people actually hold, right? Has kind of infiltrated public consciousness, maybe to help that kind of nonsense along, maybe. I don't know that that's really based on a fair hearing of some of the points that postmodern thinkers will make.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the most extreme level, I suppose where it can lead to a complete relativism or is thought to do so, yeah, these things trickle down ultimately. I suppose.
So
Um,
one last thing before we end, we mentioned Jonathan Sachs,
yeah.
the preamble when we had a conversation, and his view on postmodernism. Because so could you just give a quick overview on that, or however long you would like, however long you have, frankly. And then the other thing is, what would you say to young people today who are living in this postmodern world of how to navigate it?
Well, Rabbi Sachs, I think, is relatively close to the sort of view I've been putting forward, which is a total and complete and utter belief, and probably to a greater extent than just the barest things I've been saying,
Mhm.
right? In let's just go with the truth of Judaism, right? So I think for sure there's absolutely no question. And like I say, probably in a more robust way that he might make more claims, both historically and metaphysically, than I would, right?
Mhm.
But absolutely. But recognizing at the same time what he called the dignity of difference,
Yeah.
right? And there's a beautiful quote that I think is in that book. I can't quite remember. But he said, we're looking at religions, it's like, going to a foreign country where you go there, you think it's beautiful, you admire the grandeur and the beauty, but it's not your home, right?
Mhm.
So he does have this view that one can appreciate what is good in other cultures, what is
Mhm.
good even in other religions, and the fact that God blesses that diversity, right?
Yeah.
That's a real theme for him, right? God didn't want everyone to be Jewish,
Yeah.
right? It's fine that people have these different views, and again, within reason, right? Different views, but there are limits to what those differences can be. Even from a Jewish perspective, we want to go with the Noahide law, right? The Sheva Mitzvot B'nai
Yeah.
Noach. But there are limits, right? There is a basis beyond which we're not really talking to civilized people, right? But yeah, I think he totally denies postmodernism in terms of the idea that there is, the extreme of there is no truth, everything's
Yeah.
relative, everything's good at everything else. He totally doesn't, absolutely would reject that.
Yeah.
But he would understand the validity of varying, even in on certain issues, contradictory, views and ways of life,
Yeah.
even believing that his is the right one.
Yeah, and you find that within Judaism itself. I've been reading the Zohar, and some of the stuff you find in there is so far out there.
Right. So like I say, because I don't, I'm not anything like well versed in mysticism, as I, at least, want to be in philosophy and claim to be up to a point.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, I think that if anything, there are more radical views to be
yeah,
found in the mystical tradition for
yeah,
sure. Yeah. So yeah, for Rabbi Sachs, like I say, I think the basics of the kind of view I've been talking about, I think do sort of appear in his work,
mhm,
which is why he was a great respected voice of faith well
yeah,
beyond the Jewish community, right? People could
yeah,
appreciate what he was putting forward, even if they didn't agree with all of his religious beliefs,
yeah,
right? And came from a different religious place. Number one. Number two, in terms of how people navigate, negotiate it,
yeah,
I wouldn't. I genuinely, I wouldn't presume to. Yeah, it's really difficult. It's really difficult, and I, have enough trouble just trying to look after my own kids, let alone anybody. I mean, mine are pretty grown up now, so it's all
yeah,
right. But yeah, I don't envy, um, you know, people growing up in this world where we are bombarded by idiocy that we have um, in our pockets access to exponential levels of it, it's very troubling. And to try and at least maintain, some sort of value to education and things that take time, like reading books and doing research and actually fact checking and verifying. But that's all just me being the old man, the old middle-aged man I am. I have no idea quite how we, other than to model. And I think the best, the people I respect most are the people who model a way of life that I look at and think, yeah, that's the way I want to be. I think the best we can all do is try and model that to a greater or lesser extent in awareness of all our own imperfections. But yeah, it's so difficult, and I don't feel qualified to really, give much advice.
It occurs to me as you were saying that you mentioned about your Sikh neighbor next door, and everyone, because you're opening up YouTube or TikTok, whatever else you have. Once upon a time, you lived in Edgware, as you and I did growing up within the Jewish community. We went to the synagogue down the road and went to Jewish schools, and that was basically the culture which you were immersed in.
Yeah.
Today, even if you're immersed in that culture, you're still immersed in all these other multitudes of other cultures and influences from people who are just as spouting false idiocy, as you mentioned, which is, so is it more difficult to then have that conviction?
The world and communities seem less cohesive nowadays in all kinds of ways, including in silly ways, right? But the silly ways aren't actually really that silly. I think back to the UK, and I think back to, just TV, right? Millions who all watch the BBC and everyone's talking about it. And now everyone's watching their own thing, the same thing. So even at those silly levels, you don't have cohesiveness. And, we live in an increasingly fragmented society in all kinds of ways. That on the one hand, so greater diversity, opportunity to learn more about more things. But on the other hand, there just does seem to be this fragmentation, and maybe the extremes we're seeing in politics now are almost a sort of manifestation of that you get these splinters even within a single party that are completely can barely talk to each other, because there's even splinters within those groupings. And look, this is just ultimately this is middle-aged man sounding off, not based on any kind of facts or research. So,
going back,
don't take it too seriously. But
no, it is. No, it is important, because you're going back to the Judaism thing, that if we're saying that Judaism says that I have my belief and my rationality is therefore more convincing, therefore I believe in it because recognizing because my culture has given me this, therefore I have it.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't really have that in the same way you used to have it, then now that kind of falls apart. The response might be, I've heard people say, well, we need to reinterpret Judaism in this postmodern way because that's what the young people believe in. Maybe that's wrong-headed is what I'm saying. Maybe we need to become more enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly a cohesive sort of culture, shall we say, would give you well, it obviously gives you greater cohesion, I guess. But on the other hand, there are disadvantages to that in terms of the kind of groupthink it leads to, such that you won't consider some alternative that maybe is better that would lead to progress, and that's where it's very complicated.
Thank you so much for this.
My
really,
pleasure.
really grateful, and it's been a very educational conversation for me, and
it's been fun for me. I mean, the last bit I should say was me talking not from any expertise, so take it for what it is.
There's some in the Gemara that even the musings of a scholar should be studied in depth. So
if you ever have musings of a scholar on here, then
well, I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure.